At 11:42 in the morning, Beijing time, inside a sealed conference room at the Zhongnanhai Leadership Compound, Xi Jinping received a cable that would force the most consequential rethink of Chinese energy strategy in a decade. The cable did not come from Tehran. It came from Chinese state-owned tanker operators reporting that their crude shipments out of the Strait of Hormuz were now moving under conditions Beijing could no longer guarantee. What happened in the 72 hours that followed exposed something the Chinese Communist Party has spent 4 years trying to hide from its own population. The 25-year, $400 billion strategic partnership signed with the Islamic Republic of Iran in March of 2021 has produced almost none of the leverage Beijing was promised. And in the waters where that leverage was supposed to matter most, Xi Jinping is now a spectator. This is the part the headlines are burying. This is what nobody is telling you about the collapse of the China-Iran corridor and why the next 90 days will determine whether Beijing's entire Belt and Road energy architecture survives in any recognizable form. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that 21-mile gap flows roughly 20% of the world's seaborne petroleum and roughly one-third of all liquefied natural gas traded internationally. For China, the figure is not abstract. Approximately half of all crude oil consumed inside the People's Republic transits through Hormuz on its way to Chinese refineries on the eastern seaboard. When that channel becomes contested, Chinese economic life becomes contested. When the United States Navy decides who passes and who does not, Beijing discovers what every other power that has tried to project influence into the Persian Gulf has eventually discovered. The Fifth Fleet does not negotiate access. It administers it. The 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership was supposed to change this calculation. Signed by then Foreign Minister Wang Yi and his Iranian counterpart Mohammad Javad Zarif on the 27th of March 2021, the agreement was framed in Tehran as a $400 billion Chinese investment commitment in exchange for stable, discounted Iranian oil. Inside Iranian state media, the deal was hailed as the document that would end American sanctions leverage forever. Inside Chinese state media, coverage was conspicuously thinner. Beijing never published the actual text. Beijing never confirmed the $400 billion figure. Beijing never committed to a single named infrastructure project on a public timeline. That asymmetry was the first warning. Tehran believed it had acquired a superpower patron. Beijing believed it had acquired a discounted oil supplier with no leverage to demand anything in return. 4 years later, the gap between those two interpretations has become the central crisis of Iranian foreign policy and a quiet humiliation for Chinese strategic planners. The numbers tell the story before the analysis does. Of the $400 billion in pledged Chinese investment, independent tracking by the American Enterprise Institute's China Global Investment Tracker has identified less than $15 billion in actual dispersed Chinese capital inside Iran since the agreement was signed. That is under 4% of the headline figure. Iranian oil exports to China did rise, peaking near 1.6 million barrels per day in mid-2024, but those barrels moved at discounts of $14 to $18 below Brent benchmark prices, sold through a shadow fleet of reflagged tankers, paid for in yuan held in Chinese banks that Iran could not freely repatriate. Tehran was not being rescued. Tehran was being warehoused. And then the corridor itself came under pressure. Israeli and American strikes against Iranian nuclear and missile infrastructure in June of 2025 destroyed capabilities Iran had spent 2 decades and hundreds of billions of dollars building. The Iranian rial, which traded at roughly 42,000 to the dollar when the Chinese partnership was signed, has since collapsed past 1 million to the dollar on the open market. Iranian inflation runs above 40% annually. The regime's foreign currency reserves, by International Monetary Fund estimation, sit below $20 billion in accessible form. Through every dimension of this collapse, the Chinese partnership has produced no rescue, no air defense systems delivered in meaningful quantity, no diplomatic shield at the United Nations Security Council strong enough to prevent the snapback of sanctions in late 2025, and no naval presence in Hormuz capable of contesting a single American decision. This is the moment. This is why the cable that reached Xi Jinping mattered. Because what Beijing now confronts is not a temporary disruption to a friendly supplier. What Beijing now confronts is the public, unmistakable demonstration that its largest strategic energy partnership outside of Russia has produced a client state that cannot defend its own oil exports, cannot defend its own airspace, and cannot defend the assumption that animated the entire deal in the first place. The clock is running, and the question being asked inside both Zhongnanhai and the Iranian Supreme National Security Council is the same question. If the partnership cannot deliver leverage in Hormuz, what exactly is it for? To understand why the $400 billion architecture has failed to translate into Chinese power projection in the Persian Gulf, it is necessary to examine four interlocking dimensions in sequence: the economic structure of the deal itself, the military reality of the Strait of Hormuz, the internal Iranian political fracture the deal exposed rather than healed, and the calculation Beijing is now making about whether to escalate, retreat, or pivot. Begin with the economics, because the economics were always the structural weakness disguised as strategic depth. The 2021 agreement was negotiated during a specific window in which both parties had sharply divergent leverage. Iran was emerging from the maximum pressure sanctions campaign of the first Trump administration. The Iranian economy had contracted by approximately 6% in 2019 and another 4% in 2020. Tehran needed cash, needed buyers, and needed a counterweight to American financial isolation. China, meanwhile, was beginning the strategic pivot that would later be formalized in its dual circulation policy, seeking secured energy supply chains insulated from American maritime interdiction. The deal made sense to both sides on paper. The problem was that the paper was vague. The text that has leaked through Iranian sources outlines Chinese investment commitments across petroleum, petrochemicals, banking, telecommunications, ports, railways, healthcare, and information technology. It outlines preferential Iranian oil supply to China at unspecified discounts. It outlines unspecified military and intelligence cooperation. What it does not outline is binding timelines, enforcement mechanisms, dispute resolution procedures, or specific dollar commitments tied to specific deliverables. In practice, this meant Beijing could perform partnership rhetorically while delivering capital only when individual projects met internal Chinese commercial criteria. Almost none of them did. Consider the comparison that haunts Iranian planners. China's actual energy infrastructure investment in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates between 2021 and 2025 exceeded $50 billion in dispersed capital across confirmed projects. Chinese investment in Iran over the same period sits below $15 billion. The Kingdom Iran was supposed to be replacing as China's preferred Gulf partner, instead became China's preferred Gulf partner. Saudi Aramco signed long-term supply contracts with Chinese refiners at market prices. Iran sold to China at fire sale discounts through sanctioned channels. The asymmetry was not subtle. It was the entire structure. Now layer the military reality on top of the economic structure. The Persian Gulf is the most heavily monitored body of water on the planet outside of the Taiwan Strait. The United States Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Manama, Bahrain, maintains continuous presence, including a carrier strike group rotation, multiple Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyers, Ticonderoga-class cruisers, attack submarines, mine countermeasure vessels, and supporting auxiliaries. The Arleigh Burke-class destroyer alone displaces approximately 9,200 tons, carries 96 vertical launch cells capable of firing Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles, Standard Missile 2 and Standard Missile 6 air defense interceptors, and vertical launch anti-submarine rockets. Each of these vessels costs approximately $2 billion to build and represents a category of capability that the People's Liberation Army Navy has only recently begun to match in its own Type 055 destroyer program, none of which operate in the Persian Gulf. China's naval presence in the broader region is anchored at its single overseas military base in Djibouti, established in 2017 on the Horn of Africa. That base sits over 1,500 nautical miles from the Strait of Hormuz. It supports anti-piracy patrols and limited expeditionary operations. It does not and was never designed to contest American sea control inside the Persian Gulf. Chinese naval task groups have transited the Strait of Hormuz periodically for port calls and joint exercises with Iran and Russia, including the Trilateral Marine Security Belt exercises conducted multiple times since 2019. These exercises are diplomatic theater. They involve a handful of vessels, last several days, and produce photographs. They do not produce sea control. The Iranian Navy and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the two parallel maritime forces of the Islamic Republic, possess substantial asymmetric capabilities. Hundreds of fast attack craft, anti-ship cruise missiles including the Noor, and the more recent Ghadir variants with ranges between 120 and 300 kilometers. Midget submarines of the Ghadir and Fateh classes. Naval mines and stockpiles estimated by the United States Office of Naval Intelligence at between 2,000 and 5,000 units. These capabilities are real. They are designed for one mission, which is to make the cost of American operations in Hormuz unacceptably high in the opening hours of any conflict. They are not designed to win that conflict, and Iranian planners know they cannot. This is the inheritance Beijing was buying into. A partner whose military doctrine in the only theater that mattered for Chinese energy security was built around imposing costs rather than achieving control. A partner whose air defenses, demonstrated in the Israeli strikes of mid-2025 and the American precision campaign that followed, could not protect critical infrastructure deep inside Iranian territory. A partner whose nuclear program, the ultimate guarantor of regime survival in Tehran's strategic conception, suffered setbacks that Iranian officials themselves have privately described as catastrophic. If anyone watching this analysis recognizes how rare it is to see the actual financial and military structure of these partnerships laid out in sequence rather than buried under cable news graphics, this is exactly the type of breakdown this channel exists to deliver. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, because the next 90 days inside the Persian Gulf are going to move faster than mainstream coverage can track, and the analysis here will not wait for permission from official statements to tell you what is actually happening. The third dimension is the internal Iranian political fracture, and this is where the Chinese partnership becomes not just disappointing, but politically toxic for the regime. The 2021 deal was championed inside Iran by figures associated with the conservative establishment around then-President Ibrahim Raisi. After Raisi's death in a helicopter crash in May of 2024 and the subsequent election of the comparatively moderate Masoud Pezeshkian in July of 2024, the political coalition that had defended the Chinese partnership lost its anchor. Pezeshkian inherited the agreement. He did not own it. Inside the Iranian establishment, the partnership has become a proxy fight for a much larger argument about the regime's strategic orientation. Hardline factions associated with the IRGC continue to defend the alignment with China and Russia as the only viable counterweight to American pressure. Pragmatist factions, including elements within the foreign ministry and the Pezeshkian government, increasingly argue that the China model has failed on its own terms and that some form of negotiated détente with Western powers must be revisited regardless of ideological cost. The Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, now in his late 80s and visibly managing succession dynamics, has not publicly resolved this argument. He has instead allowed both factions to continue contesting it, which has paralyzed Iranian foreign policy at the precise moment decisive action was required. The financial consequences of this paralysis are measurable. Iranian oil exports, after peaking above 1.6 million barrels per day in 2024, have declined under tightened American secondary sanctions enforcement to between 600,000 and 900,000 barrels per day, depending on the source consulted. Approximately 90% of those remaining exports go to China, mostly to small independent refineries known as teapots in Shandong province, which can be more easily insulated from American financial scrutiny than major state-owned refiners. At a conservative estimate of $15 per barrel below Brent, and assuming an average of 750,000 barrels per day, Iran is foregoing approximately $11 million per day in revenue compared to what those same barrels would generate at market prices in unsanctioned trade. That is roughly $4 billion per year. Over the 4 years since the partnership was signed, the cumulative discount transferred from Iran to Chinese refiners exceeds $15 billion. The supposed beneficiary has been subsidizing the supposed benefactor. The fourth dimension is the calculation Beijing is now making, and this is where strategic ambiguity becomes operationally dangerous for Tehran. Chinese decision-making about the Iran partnership is being shaped by three converging pressures that did not exist in 2021. First, Chinese economic growth has slowed substantially, with official 2024 figures landing near 5% and independent estimates suggesting actual growth closer to 3 to 4%. Capital is more constrained than it was. Beijing cannot afford to disburse the full $400 billion even if it wanted to. Second, the Chinese relationship with Saudi Arabia and the UAE has become more economically important than the relationship with Iran. The 2023 Beijing brokered restoration of Saudi-Iranian diplomatic relations was widely interpreted as a Chinese diplomatic victory, but the substantive economic relationship that followed flowed overwhelmingly toward Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, not Tehran. Chinese refiners now buy more crude from Saudi Arabia than from any other supplier. Disrupting that relationship by visibly arming Iran or contesting American operations on Iran's behalf would cost Beijing more than the entire Iran partnership is worth. Third, the European theater has consumed Chinese strategic attention in ways the 2021 agreement did not anticipate. The Russian war in Ukraine, the deepening Sino-Russian no-limits partnership, the secondary sanctions exposure Chinese banks now face from supporting Russian war economy transactions, and the European Union's increasingly assertive posture toward Chinese subsidized exports have all created a strategic environment in which Beijing's bandwidth for additional confrontation with Washington over Iran is sharply limited. The result is a Chinese posture toward the current Hormuz situation that can be summarized in one sentence. Beijing will protest American actions verbally, will continue purchasing Iranian oil at distressed prices through shadow channels, will offer no military guarantees, will not deploy naval forces to contest American interdiction operations, and will quietly accelerate diversification away from Iranian crude towards Saudi, Emirati, and Russian supply. Tehran is being abandoned in slow motion, with diplomatic language carefully calibrated to ensure the abandonment is not formally acknowledged on either side. This is the part that should arrest your attention. The Chinese-Iranian partnership has not been formally broken. It has been hollowed out from the inside while both governments continue to recite the rhetoric of strategic alignment. Tehran cannot acknowledge the hollowing without conceding that its primary geopolitical strategy of the last 5 years has failed. Beijing cannot acknowledge it without conceding that its flagship Belt and Road Energy Partnership in the Middle East has produced a humiliated client. So both sides keep talking. And the actual balance of power in Hormuz keeps tilting further toward the United States Fifth Fleet, which does not need to issue press releases to demonstrate where the leverage actually lies. Historical parallel matters here. In 1988, during Operation Praying Mantis, the United States Navy destroyed a substantial portion of the Iranian surface fleet in a single afternoon following Iranian mining of the USS Samuel B. Roberts. The operation involved the sinking of the Iranian frigate Sahand, severe damage to the frigate Sabalan, and the destruction of multiple Iranian fast attack craft and oil platforms used for military purposes. The strategic lesson of that engagement, never forgotten by American naval planners and clearly remembered in Tehran, was that direct conventional naval confrontation with the United States in the Persian Gulf produces predictable and devastating outcomes for Iran. 37 years later, the underlying military balance has shifted further in the American direction, not toward parity. The Chinese partnership was supposed to offset this asymmetry. It has not. The deeper parallel is the late Cold War experience of Soviet client states that discovered, in moments of crisis, that the patrons' commitments did not extend to actual military intervention on their behalf. Egypt in 1973, after the initial Soviet airlift, found that Moscow would not risk superpower confrontation to preserve Egyptian gains. Vietnam, after 1975, found that Soviet support did not translate into protection from Chinese punitive operations in 1979. Cuba, throughout the late 1980s, watched Soviet subsidies evaporate as Moscow's own crisis deepened. Client states learned the same lesson repeatedly across history. Patron commitments are conditional on patron capacity and patron interest, and both can change faster than treaty language suggests. For one more moment, consider what this means in practical terms inside the Iranian decision-making apparatus over the next 90 days. The regime confronts a sanctions environment that has tightened, an economy in measurable distress, a military whose conventional deterrent has been demonstrated to be insufficient, a nuclear program whose recovery timeline is contested even within the Iranian scientific establishment, a primary patron whose commitments are not materializing, and a domestic population whose tolerance for further economic deterioration is unknown but visibly declining. Every door Tehran might walk through to escape this position passes either through Washington or through a level of Chinese commitment that Beijing has now demonstrated it will not provide. If this analysis is the kind of structural breakdown you actually want, the kind that does not pretend the answers are simpler than the questions, subscribe and turn on notifications. The next phase of this story is the Iranian response, and it will not wait. The implications of the Chinese hollowing extend in 3 directions, each carrying distinct uncertainty and each capable of producing dramatically different outcomes depending on decisions that have not yet been made. The first direction is internal Iranian. If the Pezeshkian government concludes that the Chinese partnership cannot deliver, the logical alternative is some form of renewed engagement with Western powers, possibly through European intermediaries, possibly through indirect channels that the Trump administration's second-term foreign policy team has signaled openness to under specific conditions. The conditions Washington has articulated publicly include verifiable nuclear program constraints, cessation of regional proxy operations, and ballistic missile limitations. Each of these conditions is more difficult to accept now, after the strikes of mid-2025, than it would have been before. The hardline factions inside Iran will argue that capitulation under pressure invites further pressure. The pragmatist factions will argue that continued resistance under collapsed economic conditions invites regime collapse itself. Whichever argument prevails will shape the trajectory of the Islamic Republic for a generation. It is genuinely uncertain which way Khamenei will tilt, and uncertain whether his successor, when that succession occurs, will inherit a state still capable of strategic choice. The second direction is Chinese. Beijing must now decide whether to formally cut its losses on the Iran partnership, quietly continuing the discounted oil purchases while abandoning any pretense of strategic alignment, or whether to attempt some symbolic gesture of support designed to preserve the partnership rhetoric without committing actual capability. The risk of the first option is that it accelerates the Iranian collapse and produces regional instability in a theater Beijing depends on for energy supply. The risk of the second option is that any symbolic gesture sufficient to matter to Tehran is also sufficient to provoke American secondary sanctions against Chinese banks and shipping companies in ways that damage the Chinese economy more than the gesture is worth. Xi Jinping has built his domestic political identity around the projection of Chinese strength. Being seen to abandon a flagship partnership under American pressure carries political costs inside the Chinese Communist Party that are not visible to outside observers, but are real to him personally. The third direction is American, and this is where the analysis becomes most difficult to predict. The Trump administration has signaled that maximum pressure on Iran will continue, that secondary sanctions enforcement will intensify, and that American naval posture in the Persian Gulf will be maintained at levels capable of deterring any Iranian closure attempt. What has not been clarified is the threshold at which American pressure converts from coercive diplomacy into actual demand for regime change, and what Washington would do if the Iranian regime, facing internal collapse, attempted a desperate provocation in Hormuz designed to force American withdrawal through cost imposition. Iranian doctrine has historically assumed that Western publics will not tolerate sustained energy price spikes and casualties from Persian Gulf operations. Whether that assumption survives contact with the current American political environment is the question on which the next 90 days may turn. Layer all three uncertainties together. An Iranian regime under collapsing economic pressure with an unresolved internal political fight. A Chinese patron quietly retreating while publicly performing alignment. An American pressure campaign whose endgame has not been articulated even inside the executive branch. Three actors, three sets of unresolved decisions, three pathways that each contain branching outcomes. The combinations produce scenarios ranging from negotiated de-escalation through limited conflict in Hormuz to broader regional war that draws in Israel, the Gulf states, and potentially Russian and Chinese deniable support for Iranian operations. There is no version of the next 90 days in which Xi Jinping recovers the leverage he believed he was buying in 2021. That money has been spent. Those barrels have been delivered. The strategic position has not materialized. What remains to be determined is whether Beijing absorbs the loss quietly or whether the loss becomes a precipitating factor in a wider crisis neither China nor the United States has fully prepared to manage. The question every viewer should be asking is which of these three scenarios is now most likely? Will Iran negotiate from collapse? Will China stage a symbolic intervention to preserve face? Or will the United States press the advantage further, forcing a resolution on terms the Islamic Republic cannot accept without surrendering the foundational claims of its own revolution? The next 48 to 72 hours of diplomatic signaling out of Beijing, Tehran, and Washington will provide the first real evidence of which trajectory is materializing. The clock is running. The $400 billion partnership has not survived contact with the Strait of Hormuz. What replaces it has not yet been decided, and the decisions being made in the coming days will shape Persian Gulf security for the rest of this decade. The story is far from over. The collapse of the China-Iran corridor does not resolve the regional crisis. It only clarifies which actor was never actually going to provide the rescue Tehran assumed. What happens next? The Iranian regime's response, Xi Jinping's choice, the American posture in the days ahead will determine whether this becomes a managed retreat or a cascading regional confrontation. Stay subscribed. Turn on notifications. The next update will follow the first significant move from any of the three capitals, and that move is coming sooner than mainstream coverage is prepared for. The question for the comments: does Iran negotiate? Does China intervene symbolically? Or does Washington press the advantage to a forced resolution? The answer is being decided now.